Not all Resident Evil DLCs are created equal. Some are short, forgettable side stories, while others completely transform how you see the main game. Over the years, Capcom has released everything from throwaway missions to expansions that feel essential to the franchise itself. Today, I'm ranking the best DLCs in Resident Evil and breaking down what makes each one stand out, starting with the one that just missed the mark, Echo 6 expansion. Here's the thing about the Echo 6 expansion. The premise is actually cool. You're playing as US Army soldiers, the Echo 6 unit, dropped into Raccoon City, not to survive the outbreak, not to investigate it, but to contain it. That's a genuinely fresh angle for Resident Evil. Every other game in the franchise puts you in the shoes of someone scrambling to understand what's happening or get out alive. Echo 6 flips it. You're the military response. You're the people the government sent in. That framing alone could carry a memorable DLC. Released in chunks throughout 2012, alongside Operation Raccoon City itself, it's a 4-player co-op campaign with 3 story missions cutting across Raccoon City locations, including the train yard and suburban zones. Total runtime sits somewhere between 2 and 3 hours, which is short but not embarrassingly short. It does what it says it's going to do, but here's where it gets complicated. Operation Raccoon City itself exists in this weird gray zone in the RE timeline. It's alternate fiction, non-canonical, or at best sitting somewhere adjacent to canon in a way the franchise has never fully committed to clarifying, which means everything that happens in Echo 6, every soldier, every mission, every dramatic standoff in that train yard carries exactly 0 weight in the actual Resident Evil story. None of it happened, none of it matters. And that's not a minor detail. That's the entire problem. The military containment perspective is interesting precisely because Raccoon City's fall is one of the defining moments in RC lore. Watching it collapse from the inside, through the eyes of soldiers trying to hold the line, should feel devastating. Instead, it just feels like a fun co-op romp dressed in familiar wallpaper. Cool idea, wrong universe. It's not bad. It's just Orphan, a DLC with no narrative home to return to. If you think a storyless military excursion is a rough way to start this list, wait until you see what the Ghost Survivors do with characters the main game left behind. The Ghost Survivors. Robert Kendo spends about 4 minutes in RE2 Remake before a zombie tears him apart in his own gun shop, and the main game gives him exactly enough screen time to make you wish it hadn't. You know who he is, you understand what he lost, and then he's gone. The Ghost Survivors gives you the chance to find out what happens if he runs instead. That's a genuinely affecting piece of game design, and it earns this DLC its spot on this list. But here's the thing. The Ghost Survivors, which dropped as a free update in February 2019, just weeks after the RE2 remake launched, is fundamentally challenge content wearing an emotional costume. 4 separate survival scenarios, each running about 15 to 20 minutes, featuring gun shop owner Robert Kendo, mayor's daughter Catherine Warren, USS Soldier Ghost, and Officer Daniel Cortini, permadeath mechanics, limited resources, no traditional story progression. The whole thing is framed as what-if survival stories, alternate timelines where these characters theoretically escape fates. The main game tells you they didn't, which is, not exactly the foundation for serious lore expansion, and that's the structural problem. The what-if framing is clearly intentional, designed to give the developers creative freedom without touching established canon. Smart decision. But it also puts a ceiling on how much any of this can matter. You're not learning anything new about Raccoon City. You're not filling in gaps. You're playing mechanical challenge scenarios attached to characters you already care about, with a thin narrative veneer that the game itself acknowledges isn't real. Kendo's scenario is the exception that proves the rule. Playing through his desperate attempt to get out of the city is the closest the franchise has ever gotten to humanizing the ordinary people caught in Umbrella's disaster. The ones who weren't soldiers or scientists or protagonists. That's worth something. That's worth quite a bit, actually. But even that is framed as a what-if he'd made it out fantasy, which undercuts the emotional weight almost immediately. The game gives you something affecting, and then immediately reminds you none of it counts. The Ghost Survivors lands at 9 because it's exceptional at what it does. The mechanics are tight, the scenarios are well designed, and getting it free through in-game challenges rather than a cash purchase was genuinely generous. It just happens to be exceptional at something that isn't narrative. The Struggle, coming in at number 8, has the opposite problem. Where Ghost Survivors has emotional potential without structural weight, The Struggle barely pretends to be anything other than what it is. The Struggle. Here's the thing about The Struggle. It's not bad. It's just the least essential stop on this list. Released in March 2015 as the first of Revelations 2's extra episodes, The Struggle drops you into a bridging chapter set between Claire's and Barry's campaigns. You're playing as Moira and Evgeny, surviving waves of enemies across hostile terrain, managing scarce resources, and fighting through encounters that connect the two halves of the main story. It's playable solo or co-op. Each session runs around 30 to 45 minutes, and it absolutely has story content attached to it, which makes ranking it this low slightly awkward to explain. So let me try. The Struggle is doing real narrative work, technically. It fills in the gap between the two campaign threads, gives Moira some additional screen time, and fleshes out Evgeny as a character who otherwise shows up in Barry's story without much context. None of that is nothing. On paper, that's exactly the kind of connective tissue DLC should provide. But here's the issue. That connective tissue is thin. The character moments are there, but they don't hit particularly hard. The story beats feel more like housekeeping than revelation. You finish The Struggle and you understand the timeline slightly better, which is fine. And also, the mildest possible compliment you can give a piece of story content. The survival mechanics are genuinely solid. The enemy encounters are well designed. If you're playing Revelations 2 as a complete package, and you want every piece of the puzzle, The Struggle belongs in your run without question. It earns its place in the broader narrative, just quietly, in the back of the room, not making eye contact with anyone. The problem isn't that The Struggle fails. It's that it doesn't do anything that stays with you. You watch the scenes, you fight the fights, you move on, and 3 days later you're mostly thinking about everything else in Revelations 2 instead. So it lands here, present, functional, and almost entirely forgettable. The next one is not forgettable in the slightest. Little Miss puts you in control of one of Revelations 2's most unsettling characters, and it actually has something to say, Little Miss. Here's a genuinely bold design choice. Take a franchise built entirely around making the player feel powerful, strip every weapon out of the protagonist's hands, and then make that protagonist a small child. That is what Little Miss does, and credit where it's due, because that takes confidence. Released in March 2015 as story DLC for Revelations 2, Little Miss puts you in control of Natalia Corda in a solo prequel segment set before the main campaign's events on the island facility. No firearms, no combat options to speak of, just stealth, puzzles, and the constant background anxiety of being the smallest and most vulnerable person in a building full of things that want to hurt you. The mechanics are designed specifically around helplessness, which is something the franchise almost never attempts. Adult protagonists in Resident Evil trip over weapons. Natalia has to think around every single encounter she faces. It's a genuinely interesting premise. Possibly the most interesting premise in Revelations 2's entire DLC lineup, and it runs for about 25 minutes. That's the whole problem. 25 minutes is barely enough time to establish the tone before the credits roll. The gap between what this DLC is attempting and what it actually delivers is frustrating in a way that feels specific to watching something promising fall short of its own ambition. You can see exactly what it wanted to be: a tense, atmospheric, character-driven prequel that expands Natalia's backstory and gives emotional weight to her role in the main campaign. It gets partway there. Her vulnerability reads, the atmosphere lands, and there are moments where the stealth mechanics click in a way that feels genuinely distinct from anything else in the franchise. But it stops. Right when it's building momentum, it stops. The larger mysteries the main game leaves open about Natalia's connection to Alex Wesker stay exactly as open after the DLC as they were before it. You get context, but not answers. Texture, but not resolution, which is either a deliberate creative choice or a scope problem. And given the runtime, it's probably the latter. Little Miss is the DLC equivalent of a great first chapter that never gets a second. The concept deserved more runway, more time to breathe, more space to actually land the emotional beats it's clearly reaching for. What you get instead is a proof of concept that proves the concept works without fully executing it. Respect for the ambition, genuine frustration at the execution. Both things are true at the same time. If you think that sounds like a DLC being limited by scope, wait until we get to Desperate Escape, which has the opposite problem entirely. Desperate Escape. Here's where the list starts getting genuinely good. Desperate Escape dropped in February 2010, roughly 11 months after RE5's launch, and it is mechanically the most intense thing in the entire game. You get Jill Valentine and Josh Stone, 5 chapters, somewhere between 1.5 to 2 hours hours, and a Kijuju that is absolutely losing its mind in its final hours before the military rolls in to clean up the mess. Enemy density is through the roof. Weapon variety is the widest it gets in any RE5 content. Crowd control becomes less of a strategy and more of a prayer. If you are playing co-op with someone who knows what they're doing, this is a genuinely punishing, genuinely rewarding experience from start to finish. The mechanical spike here is real, and it's worth talking about plainly. This isn't RE5 coasting on its existing template. This is RE5 turning the difficulty dial until something starts making a noise and turning it a bit more just to see what happens. The encounter design forces constant communication between players in a way the main campaign rarely demands. You are not getting through some of these sections on autopilot. Players who went in expecting another campaign-paced experience got humbled pretty quickly, and the ones who came back for a second run did so because it earned it. But here's the honest conversation. Desperate Escape runs concurrently with Chapter 5-3 of the main campaign. Jill and Josh are racing across Kijuju specifically to reach Chris and Sheva before the Wesker confrontation reaches its climax. The story is still very much in motion. What this DLC doesn't do is expand it in any meaningful direction. You're filling in a gap that existed off-screen, watching events unfold in parallel, rather than learning anything new about the world or to the people in it. Jill gets some room to breathe as a character after spending most of the main game as a boss fight memory, which is something, but the DLC doesn't dig into it the way it could have. Nothing here recontextualizes the main campaign on a second playthrough. You finish it and you understand the timeline better, but you don't understand the story differently. That's not a deal breaker. It just means the ranking has a ceiling. Story-focused players will finish this and feel satisfied without feeling like they missed something essential. Co-op players will have a fantastic time and immediately want to run it again. And both of those things are true at once, and it lands here because the gameplay quality earns it a spot in the upper half of this list, even when the narrative doesn't push it any higher. Desperate Escape is the moment you realize this list has been building towards something. The quality is climbing. If you think this one hits hard, Lost in Nightmares is about to completely rewrite the conversation. Lost in Nightmares. There's a difference between DLC that extends a game and DLC that improves one. Lost in Nightmares is the second type, and that's rarer than it sounds. Released about a year after RE5, this is a prequel co-op campaign featuring Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine across 4 chapters, running somewhere between 1.5 to 2 hours. Short. But here's the thing. Lost in Nightmares is doing something that almost no DLC bothers to do. It's filling an actual hole in the main story rather than padding out the space after the ending. RE5 opens with a flashback, Chris and Jill infiltrating a facility, something going wrong, Jill disappearing. The main campaign gestures at what happened there, and then moves on, treating it as backstory you're supposed to accept on faith. Lost in Nightmares is that backstory, made playable. You're not getting bonus content tacked onto the end of a finished story. You're getting the scene the main game skipped. That structural distinction matters more than it might seem. When you play RE5, after completing Lost in Nightmares, the opening hits differently. The facility isn't abstract setup anymore. It's somewhere you've been. You know what Chris and Jill found there. You know what Wesker was doing in that building and why it mattered to his broader agenda. The DLC doesn't just add context, it retroactively sharpens the thing you already played. Wesker specifically benefits from this. RE5's main campaign frames him as a world-ending threat, but doesn't spend much time explaining the infrastructure behind that threat. Lost in Nightmares shows the bioweapon development pipeline he was running, the scale of what he was building toward, and why the Spencer Estate facility was central to it. It adds weight to a villain the main game sometimes treats as a plot function rather than an actual character with a coherent plan. That's the argument for why Lost in Nightmares ranks above Desperate Escape, and it's not even close. Desperate Escape is more of the same, competently executed, fun with a co-op partner, and completely disposable to your understanding of RE5 as a whole. Lost in Nightmares is the only RE5 DLC that makes the base game better by existing. DLC that retroactively enriches what you've already played is categorically more valuable than DLC that just gives you more of it, and this one earns that designation cleanly. The fact that it took a year and a separate purchase to get a scene this important into the RE5 experience is, not ideal, but strip away the release context and what's left is one of the better narrative DLC arguments in the franchise. End of Zoe goes somewhere different entirely, trading plot architecture for something a lot more personal and a lot more emotionally strange. End of Zoe. Joe Baker is not a character who should work. He's Zoe's uncle, Jack Baker's brother. He wasn't in RE7's base game at all. He punches mutants with his bare hands, and the entire DLC DLC he anchors runs about an hour. On paper, that sounds like a disaster. In practice, End of Zoe is one of the more emotionally honest pieces of DLC Resident Evil has ever produced, and Joe Baker specifically is a massive reason why. Released in December 2017, roughly 11 months after RE7's January launch, End of Zoe picks up immediately after the main game's ending and asks a question the base game left deliberately unanswered. What actually happened to Zoe? She survived the Baker estate barely, but the mold exposure left her in rough shape, and the DLC doesn't sugarcoat that. Her condition is bad. Joe finds her, and the rest of the runtime is him fighting through the swamp to save her. Here's the thing about Joe as a protagonist. He has 0 firearms proficiency. His entire combat system is built around punching things and hitting them with blunt objects. That sounds like a downgrade from RE7's oppressive tension, and mechanically it is a different experience, but tonally it fits perfectly. Joe isn't a trained survivor navigating a nightmare. He's a stubborn man who loves his family and refuses to stop. The tonal shift from helpless dread to raw physical determination mirrors exactly what the story needs, and the game commits to it completely. Every fight feels grounded in desperation rather than tactical survival, which is a strange thing to say about a man who punches mutant alligators, but here we are. The Baker family tragedy is one of RE7's strongest elements, and End of Zoe earns its place in that story because it approaches the same material from the inside. Ethan Winters is an outsider who stumbles into the Baker horror. Joe Baker was born into it. His grief over what happened to his family, his protectiveness over Zoe specifically, it all hits differently because this is his home, his people, and his loss. That emotional specificity is what elevates the DLC past its runtime, and the runtime is genuinely the one real complaint here. 1 hour, maybe 1.5 if you explore. For paid story DLC, expanding on a narrative as rich as RE7's, that's almost criminally brief. The combat system, while charming, lacks the depth to sustain itself much longer, and the story wraps just as you're fully invested in where it's going. It doesn't overstay its welcome because it barely arrives before it's gone. Mixed critical reception is probably fair. The emotional payoff for Zoe's arc is real. Joe Baker as a character is a genuine surprise, but the experience ends before it fully breathes, and the melee-focused mechanics will always feel like a side attraction compared to the main game's horror DNA. End of Zoe punches above its weight, sometimes literally, just not quite far enough. Not a Hero, on the other hand, brings someone back who the franchise has needed to re-examine for a very long time. Not a Hero. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. A free DLC, released 11 months after launch, is quietly one of the most important pieces of media in the modern Resident Evil franchise. Not because it has the best gameplay, not because it's the longest, but because, without it, a mainline sequel doesn't fully make sense. That's the situation with Not a Hero, and it's a weirder compliment than it sounds. Released in December 2017 as a free update for every owner of Resident Evil 7, Not a Hero puts you in control of Chris Redfield across a standalone scenario set in the Baker property following the main campaign's events. Gameplay runs somewhere between 1 and 1.5 hours, and it feels noticeably different from RE7's first-person horror, leaning harder into traditional RE action, which makes sense given Chris has a full military kit rather than a flashlight and a desperate attitude. But the gameplay isn't the point. The point is what this DLC does to Resident Evil 8. If you walk into RE8's opening cold, Chris Redfield's behavior feels, at minimum, suspicious, and at maximum, completely unhinged. He shows up, he does something drastic, and the game asks you to trust that there's a reason. And there is a reason. A specific, documented narrative reason that Not a Hero spent an hour and a half building. Chris's awareness of the mold crisis, his understanding of what it does to people, his involvement with the Umbrella's cleanup operation, all of that is established here. Without this DLC, RE8's opening scene is a gut punch with no setup. With it, it hits completely differently because you understand exactly what Chris knows and why he makes the call he makes. That is a free DLC doing load-bearing narrative work for a full-price mainline sequel, which raises the obvious question the fan community has been asking since 2017, why wasn't this in the base game? RE7 shipped without Chris's perspective on events that Chris was apparently deeply involved in, and players had to wait the better part of a year to get the half of the story that contextualizes a major character's arc. The common answer is that Capcom wanted to launch RE7 as a standalone horror experience without diluting Ethan's isolated perspective, and that's a defensible creative decision. The less comfortable answer is that Not a Hero feels essential enough to the broader story that leaving it out of the original package was always going to look strange in hindsight, and it does look strange, especially now, sitting on the other side of RE8, where Not a Hero's events are basically prerequisite reading. It's free, it's short, and it's one of the few DLCs on this list that changes how you experience something outside of itself. That combination earns it a spot this high, even if the runtime keeps it from climbing further. Speaking of DLCs that fundamentally change how you experience a mainline entry, Separate Ways does everything Not a Hero does, and then adds 4 more hours of it. Separate Ways. Here's the thing about Separate Ways. It's a remake of a DLC from 2005, which means it should, by every reasonable expectation, feel like exactly what it is. Old content dressed up in new clothes. A nostalgia play. Something you play once and forget. Turns out, no. Released in September 2023 alongside the RE4 remake base game, Separate Ways does something that almost no remake DLC has ever pulled off. It takes a story you already know, starring a character you've already played, across locations you've already cleared, and somehow makes it feel essential. Not just good, essential. The kind of content where finishing it makes you look back at the main campaign differently and realize you were only seeing half the picture. That's not a small thing. Small, that's genuinely hard to do. The original 2005 Separate Ways was a bonus mode. Fun, appreciated by fans, but structurally it was Ada running parallel to Leon and occasionally explaining why certain things happened off-screen. It was connective tissue, not a story in its own right. The 2023 remake takes that skeleton and rebuilds it from the ground up. Ada's motivations are expanded. Her internal conflict with Wesker, with her own sense of self, with what she actually owes anyone, gets actual weight and screen time. There are scenes and story details in this DLC that do not exist anywhere in the RE4 remake's main campaign, which means if you played the base game and skipped this, you got an incomplete version of the story, not missing bonus context. Functionally incomplete. That's a bold design choice, and Capcom absolutely commits to it. The runtime backs that up too. 4 to 5 hours across the remastered engine, with new weapons, alternate encounter routes, and mechanical options that aren't available anywhere in the base game. The grappling hook alone changes how you move through environments you already spent 20 hours navigating, which does something genuinely clever. It makes familiar spaces feel unfamiliar again. This is not a bonus mode. This is an expansion in the actual sense of the word, not the marketing sense. You could put this next to any other game's full story DLC, and it holds up on length and content density without flinching. The fan debate around it is interesting. Some people argue it's an elaborate retread because the broad strokes of Ada's arc were always there in 2005. The counter-argument, which is the correct one, is that what you actually experience matters more than what the outline says. Ada in 2023 is a fundamentally different character to spend time with than Ada in 2005, because the writing cares about why she does things now, rather than just what she does. That recontextualization bleeds backward into the main campaign. Things Leon experiences look different once you've seen Ada's side of those same events. That's genuinely new storytelling, even if the chapter headings look familiar. Second place on a list like this means something. There's only one DLC in this entire video that edges it out, and that comes down to a very specific argument about narrative stakes. But Separate Ways makes that argument genuinely close, which is more than almost anything else here can say. Speaking of narrative stakes, Shadows of Rose is waiting, and it has a case to make. Shadows of Rose. Every DLC on this list does the same thing at its core. It looks backward. It fills gaps, expands moments, gives context to things that already happened. That's what good DLC does, and every entry on this list does it well. Shadows of Rose does something completely different. It looks forward. Released in October 2022, about a year after RE8's base game, this is roughly 3 to 4 hours of paid story content where you play as Rosemary Winters, Ethan's daughter, now grown up, navigating a version of the RE8 castle filtered through her own psychic abilities. And those abilities come directly from the mold she inherited from her father, the same mold that defined the entire RE7 and RE8 arc. The central conflict isn't a monster or a bioweapon corporation, it's Rose herself, trying to purge the parasitic infection that is literally woven into her existence. That's not a gameplay hook, that's a character study disguised as a DLC. Here's the thing about where RE8 leaves Rose at the end of the base game. She's a child. She's the reason everything happened. The thing Ethan sacrificed himself to protect, but she's passive. She's the object of everyone else's actions. Her father dies for her. The Duke transports her. Chris extracts her. Rose, in the base game, is a symbol. She's what the story means, not someone who drives it. She exists at the center of every major emotional beat and has zero agency over any of them. Shadows of Rose ends that version of her permanently. By the time this DLC concludes, Rose has confronted the mold entity trying to consume her from the inside, has actively used her inherited psychic abilities as weapons, and has established herself as someone with genuine control over her own condition and her own future. The internal version of the castle she navigates isn't just a backdrop, it's a direct externalization of her psychological state. The trauma and power and grief all collapsed into one surreal environment that she has to fight through and master. The recontextualization is complete. She isn't Ethan's daughter who survived, she's a protagonist who is ready, and Capcom has not walked any of that back. Every signal since this DLC dropped points toward Rose as a central figure in wherever the franchise goes next. That matters in a way that's hard to overstate, because it means this DLC doesn't just add to Resident Evil's history, it's actively building Resident Evil's future. You are watching a character origin story in real time, and it's packaged as a 3-hour expansion that some people almost skipped entirely because they assumed it was optional flavor content. It is the opposite of optional. The fan response has been almost uniformly enthusiastic about what this DLC does for Rose specifically. Players who dismissed her in the base game as backstory furniture came out of Shadows of Rose genuinely invested in where her arc goes. That's a complete reversal of perception achieved in one DLC, which is frankly a more impressive result than most full games manage across multiple entries. But here's where it gets a little uncomfortable, because the conversation around Shadows of Rose has another dimension that hasn't gone away. A significant portion of the community's position is that this content should have been in the base game, that the emotional and narrative weight of what Rose's story adds to RE8's themes is substantial enough that shipping RE8 without it was a mistake, or at least a deliberate choice, to monetize what should have been the complete version of the story. That debate is legitimate. 3 to 4 hours of content that fundamentally reframes your main character's legacy and establishes the next era of the franchise is not supplementary material. That's the ending you didn't know you were missing. Whether Capcom made that call for creative reasons or financial ones, the DLC exists, and it's extraordinary. It earns the top spot on this list not because it's the most polished or the most replayable or the most mechanically inventive, but because it's the only DLC here that changes what Resident Evil is going to be, not just what it was. Every other entry enriches the past. Shadows of Rose is the first chapter of something new. That's the best thing a DLC can possibly be. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.